Hello and welcome to Occult Book Review. This week's book is Demons and Spirits of the Land, Ancestral Lore and Practices by Claude Lecouteux. In this particular book, the focus is upon how natural forces, demons, spirits changed over time, particularly when Christianity took over the belief systems of Europe. The book focuses quite a lot on Northern European myths, but it does also incorporate myths from Ireland, Scotland, Britain as well. In this particular book then, you're looking at natural forces and how spirits had to change in order to save the population in some ways, to stop them from being destroyed as or killed as heretics, and how there's something within the spirits themselves that keeps changing and allows them to survive all the different belief systems that pile on top of each other, which causes problems, and which is the focus of the book. How do we dig beneath all the different layers to find out what these natural forces represented? If you were living in medieval times, you would have been astounded at things like dolmens and stone circles, all these giant menhirs and boulders of such size that your first thought would have been no normal human being could have built this place. No one could have moved these stones. And in some ways, this played into the hands of the Christian writers, although it also caused them problems too, because it was all very well saying that giants and dwarfs and fairies built these sanctuaries and these places of these shrines, if you like, but they had to also accommodate their own Christian creation myths. So what were they going to do with stories like Adam and Eve and the flood? So for a lot of the medieval Christian writers, their explanation was that giants were spirits that survived the flood, and afterwards they became dwarfs and fairies and demons. One thing that's worth pointing out here is when something is described as a giant, sometimes it's not a description of the spirit's size. It's just a classification, just a way of letting you know that this particular creature is not human. This same phenomenon is also applied to fairy. If you look back on the history of fairy, it's not the description of a creature. Sometimes it's also a description of a realm, Fairyland. So what happened then was that the Christian writers knew that they had to try to it was very hard to displace the pagan beliefs. So the way to do it for them was to put their own stories on top of the pagan stories, to name pagan places Christian places, to associate the stories with saints as opposed to the spirits or demons that the people knew. So you had Christian synod after synod calling for the destruction of these shrines. So what would happen was that people would go out and smash up the pagan shrines and replace the monuments with crosses. And you can still see this. You can see it in Ireland, where I live, quite a lot actually. If you look on most high mountains, there's a cross there now, but there used to be pagan megalithic structures. There are still the remnants. Crowpatrick would be a particularly famous mountain here in Ireland, where people go on a pilgrimage to honour St. Patrick, but it was actually a pagan place of worship thousands of years before that. Baltinglass Hill would be another example. So when this is occurring, what's said to be happening in the Christian version of events is that the saint is civilizing the landscape. So the deforestation, the ending of the mysterious, fearful place, by people moving in there, by structures being built upon the landscape. It sanctifies it in a Christian context, but desanctifies it in the older pagan context. So we see in saints' stories, and quite a lot of saint stories, there's a killing or the banishing of the snake or the dragon, for example. Now, in a lot of these stories as well, it's important to note that a transgression or an act of violence or a taboo upon that same land can allow the spirit to return again. And you see this over and over in the stories and examples in the book, from Nordic and Viking stories to Irish mythology to German mythology. It happens quite a lot. So in this context, the spirit is representing the wildness of the land, and it's almost when a sin according to Christian tradition is committed, a doorway, if you like, opens and the spirit can return again. There are also some tantalizing possible connections to much older myths, which I would associate with Mesopotamia and Babylon, but I'm sure they go back much further than that. One example that I remember from the book is the way Viking kings or even German kings or people of heroes, for example, would have their bodies cut up and different parts would be buried in different mounds, even though the mounds or the dolmens may have been there already, but they would be buried there in order to sanctify the land. Now that reminded me of the story of Tiamat, which is the serpent who gave birth to the world and again was cut up and scattered around. And I suppose maybe you could link that to the Osiris story as well. Actually, I'm sure there are hundreds and hundreds of stories that have that particular theme. But in the context of this particular book, we're talking about a way to bless the land or give the land power based on the attributes of a human. Now this ties into later chapters in the book where scholars are still arguing about whether the spirits are always here or whether they kind of grow out of legends based on heroes and kings. One particular example is Halfdan the Black, I think, who was a Viking king, and he was cut up and buried in order to kind of give power to the land. Now what happens then is the closer you are to where this relic is buried, the more protected you are, and you have these kind of concentric circles of power coming out from the kind of emanating from where this particular person is buried. It's quite obvious then that we can see parallels even in some of the books I've spoken about previously, the Wentz ideas of fairy being the dead, for example. So here we have another connection to the spirits and demons being worshipped are actually associated with the energy or the power of a once human king or queen being buried in order to sanctify the land again. You have kind of the dead being a conduit between the spirit world and the physical world, and so this then leads to kind of shrines and pilgrimages, which, as I've said already, eventually end up being taken over, and these people are given Christian attributes and names instead. The author talks about Welsh manuscripts as well in the book, and how there are stories of great heroes preventing the takeover by rival tribes because they would bury their dead in certain locations, and the power of this body or hero created a kind of a spiritual force field, I suppose. So one of the interesting vectors from that would be that the dead are never really dead in the first place, because if they still have the power to affect change, to prevent invasion and so on, the dead are both in our physical world and in the spiritual world as well. And you see that over and over again in a lot of the stories that Lecouteux talks about. You could tie this to people who say that they glimpse the other world when they go to sacred places, and this turns up in fairy lore, turns up in even contemporary mystics who will go to a stone circle or an ancient place and say that they've had glimpses of a spiritual realm. Sometimes people will return and say they've seen the architecture of heaven, or that they've glimpsed a fairy being at dawn or dusk or something like that. And this is just another example of the mingling and the entwined nature of the demon lair, of the wildness of the land. If there's still something, there's still a remnant of the pagan nature of the place, then that seems to be a way, that a window, if you like, into the spiritual world. The darker aspects of that particular train of thought is that those killed in a kind of those murdered, for example, or killed in a treacherous way, in the Icelandic Book of Settlements, for example, they're always allowed to have vengeance, which means that, I suppose it ties down to the idea of respecting the ancestors. When you go to an ancient place, you don't know what went on there. It's all very well if an archaeologist says, oh, we found the ashes or bones of a family or so on, but if they found other bones or people who seem to have died violently, the people growing up in that area who knew about this and knew who was buried there would themselves assume that this spirit, the spirit of this person, would still roam the area and could be called upon for favors of a certain nature, depending on the character of the spirit, I suppose. Because of this, these pagan places are still considered a boundary between the other world and the physical world. And because of the blurring of the lines between the humans and the mythological creatures and the spiritual and religious deities, Christian writers later began to blend everything into one particular figure, which is the devil. So we end up with places that had nothing to do with the devil in terms of name being named. The devil's this, the devil's peak, the devil's mountain, whatever. It's just a remnant of the fact that it was a place that was sacred to pagans, and it was an easier way, and well, maybe not an easier way, it was just something that happened culturally over time, depending on how vindictive or how evangelical a priest or monk was. Some might have allowed the old pagan beliefs to stay in some particular way, you know, like kind of give a nod to a holy well and say, oh yeah, there's a fairy there or whatever, whereas others would just say, no, that's a place of the devil, we call this the devil's well, we call this the devil's river, or so on. So that whole idea of boundaries is explored in great detail then in the second half of the book, and it's something that occultists and magicians might find very interesting, even though they may not think that the book goes into these aspects. But what the author does is he stresses lines and descriptions within old folklore, and shows how they're actually spells in themselves. Now, whether or not they were spells hidden, like in a grimoire way, because they were fearful of being destroyed or burnt at the stake for being a devil worshipper, or whether or not it was just a way to kind of pass on in an occult way knowledge that wasn't for everyone. That's kind of up in the air, I suppose. But the whole idea of making boundaries, making circles, making something sacred is explored, and the author goes into details, you know, the spirits associated with mountains, with forests, with rivers, with moors. He talks about Beowulf and the association there with like wild, desolate places. And another interesting aspect that the author goes into when it comes to the Beowulf story is how Grendel had to be killed by a supernatural weapon, you know, and this it comes up quite a lot in the stories in the book. The demons and the spirits, in some ways, to be completely banished, they have to be killed by something that's out beyond this world, whereas in other contexts they can just be sent away or buried, but not destroyed. So we see that coming up, like when a king wants to declare a particular land his own, for example, he might fire an arrow into the air and all that area is considered his now. He's asking permission from the spirits to take that land. So this also gives us an interesting outlook into the idea of asking permission from the spirits before we can do anything. And these stories again are very Christianized later on. There are lots of stories in Irish Christian mythology about saints who want to get a certain amount of land from a pagan king. Saint Bridget is a good example, and she's said to have put down her cloak. The pagan king says, place your cloak on the ground and as much land as your cloak covers you can have. He's thinking, of course, that her cloak will only cover a few meters, but she puts down her cloak and it begins to grow and grow, and she's given the land through supernatural means. So the idea of boundaries and taking things from the supernatural also brings up all kinds of consequences later on. Of course, as I've already said, if you commit a transgression later on, you allow the demon or spirit back again. I've only really touched the surface of this book. There's great kind of exploration of mythology, of the kind of hybridization of different myths and legends and belief systems, of course. So it's another book I would recommend highly. It's Demons and Spirits of the Land, Ancestral Lore and Practice by Claude Lecouteux, and it's from Inner Traditions. So thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you again next week.